They called her just the help. Then he stood up and said her name. "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone," he said. The town of Marrow's Bend sat like a bruise on the flat of the prairie, a smudge of roofs and wooden signs and a single main street that held the post office, the marshal's office, a blacksmith, a feed store, and the Silver Spur Saloon. Dust lay in the joints of the boards, a quiet, steady presence that got in the seams of clothes and the inside of mouths and settled on the tops of tin cups until the enamel looked as old as the wagon posts. Wind came through like a messenger. It whispered through cracked windows, it rattled shutters at night, and it carried with it the scent of hay and horses and the faint, sharp tang of another man's whiskey. She worked at the Silver Spur, not because she'd wanted to but because the town had offered few options and the saloon had, at first glance, not been unkind. They'd given her a room above the kitchen, a thin mattress and a steady hand. Steady pay in a way that meant fewer nights with an empty belly. They'd also given her work that smelled of grease and smoke and coffee, that asked for long hours and hands that could scrape plates and throw a mop through slatted floors until the boards shone like teeth. They called her Ruthie, though few knew that had been what her mother used to call her in baby talk, and not the sort of name meant for a woman who could saddle a horse and milk a cow and mend a shirt without a pattern. They called her just the help, when they wanted to remind her of the place she'd been put in by a town that liked order and labels. Her hair was braided crosswise at the nape of her neck and her hands were calloused and precise. She had a face that shut down when it needed to, the mouth a line, the jaw set, and when she gazed at someone the look would run over them like the way of a scale. People took to leaving her be because she kept to her work, because she cleaned and cooked and carried trays without complaint, and because, too, some part of the town liked her not talking too much. That kept trouble from blooming. She'd been alone for a long while. Her husband had gone the way men like him did in the canyon years back, a thin paragraph in a newspaper that no one read twice. She'd held on to his saddle for a month until the sheriff took it down off the wall and stacked it with other things that men had left behind in haste. Boots on a porch, a hat in a field. After that there had been work and the slow stitch of days. She kept her head high because her mother had taught her that the spine must not be curved even if the shoulders were tired. Stoicism suited Ruthie, and it suited the Silver Spur. The saloon had two doors, a heavy one that creaked and a back one that led to the kitchen, where Ruthie lived in a boxy room above the rafters. In the morning the sound of horses came first, a distant whinny or the clack of a passing team. Then the kettle hissed and the lamps were lit and she set out the cups, fingers nimble as a spider's. The coffee was the color of old leather and it steamed in tin mugs. Steam rose and fogged the panes in the winter and made the sun look like something you could press a thumbprint into. The place betrayed itself in small motions. The barkeep's hand finding the same glass, the lounge singer's throat clearing, the sheriff nursing a coffee with a stare that belonged to old regrets. The town's small cruelties were plain and precise. There was Eliza Crane, the preacher's wife, who kept her skirts ironed and her mouth sharp. She would glance at Ruthie and say, loud enough for the room to hear, "We all do what work God gives us, but some of us are called to better things." Her words landed like small stones. The preacher himself coughed and looked up at the ceiling when he felt uncomfortable. He believed in sin as a mountain to be climbed, and Ruthie's plain dress was one of the footholds his sermons could stand on. Sheriff Cole, broad-shouldered, half his hair already salted with knowing, would straighten at Eliza's jab and look away. It was easier. It was how small towns stayed small, by the quiet amputation of people who didn't fit. "He don't belong here either," she'd heard them say of others, a phrase passed like currency. And yet the saloon held its own sort of honor. It offered Ruthie a place where a man could be a man and a woman could be just part of the furniture. The regulars were able to tip a hat and call a drink and ignore the dirty glass at the corner of the counter when it displeased them. They barked and joked and held grudges in the same measure. That was life. She performed kindness in the margins. It was how she lived because she had no other language. When the old widow Mrs. Pritchard's arthritis clenched her fingers into a fist and she couldn't butter her bread, Ruthie came by with a loaf and a hand. When little Annie Klein, with a cough as thin as a twig, needed boiled water and a cloth on her brow, Ruthie wrapped the cloth and sat for a while. She mended as she moved. A shirt for Mr. Lang's boy, a hem for the saloon singer's dress, A scorched pot given new life with wire and patience. People could have traded her kindness for obligation and mock pity, but she never asked anything for it. Her generosity happened quietly, was soil laid under the boards, hidden but sustaining. The man who would change the town's small arithmetic first arrived on a late afternoon when the sky was the color of old pewter and the wind had that certain brine of coming rain. He walked in like a season, steady, weathered, with a presence that made the room hush without any command. He wore the look of someone who had been through things and kept their scars as if they were maps. His hat was tan leather, turned up at the brim, and his boots had a certain scuff that offered proof he'd gone through rough miles. What made him notable, though, was his quiet. He didn't listen like everybody else. He had a way of observing that made the world under him hush and get honest. They called him Eli Hargrove, though at first he wasn't called anything at all. He was just the man who wandered in off the road and ordered coffee. Eli took a seat at the bar as if he'd found the place before he'd ever known it. Ruthie poured him a mug and set it down with the same firm gentleness she used to lay a baby in a crib. He held the cup between rough fingers that betrayed nothing of softness. When she looked at him, her eyes did not spare warmth, but neither did they demand it. There was a ledger kept in his face, an old account that worried at the edges of whatever story he told by the line of his lips. He watched the room in a way that looked like reading a book he'd put down and picked up again, and for reasons Ruthie couldn't pin down, he found his gaze landing on her more than once. For days he kept to himself. He helped the barkeep mend a busted lantern on the back stoop. He listened to Eliza's sermons with a polite squint, and he paid his debts as if he owed no part of his steadiness to the town. He had a hand that could smooth a saddle or take the reins in a storm. Rumors began to gather around him like flies. He'd been a soldier. He'd ridden with men she didn't want to imagine. He'd been in a place where promises were cheaper than bullets. People put their own pages into his book until he became a collage of other people's fears. Took him longer than the rest to learn Ruthie's name. He listened to the way she moved and the rust of her silence. He learned that she did not talk of herself, but she watched the way the town folded itself around her. He noticed a scar on the inside of her forearm, a pale little crescent that spoke of an old burn, and he recognized the steadiness of hands that had once been asked to do the impossible. He sensed, in the pauses of her breath when she thought no one was listening, a story. He didn't ask it, he didn't pry. In the beginning he held observation like an offering. The town's envy took the shape of Eliza Crane. Eliza had married into a life that prized propriety. She had a set place in the church and at the club. She kept a ledger of moral debts that she liked to settle with a forked tongue. When she saw what she perceived as a woman stepping out of line, when she saw Ruthie handing out bread and tending to the child's cough with more tenderness than some Sunday sermons, she took it as an affront. Her barbs were small and precise. They scratched at the underbelly of people's dignity until someone bled for the amusement of others. "She's a public burden," Eliza declared one afternoon as the saloon hummed with conversation and the string of a guitar. She stood with hands lifted, speaking as if from a pulpit that had been set fake in this place of sin. A woman of her station should be better attended by decency. If a man were to walk in and expect charity, we tell him straight to his face that work is honest, but we don't serve idleness. The men laughed like the sound of knuckles against a table. Sheriff Cole gave a little cough that was more reflex than agreement. Ruthie kept her face still. She finished what she was doing, set the cups in the sink, and went back to the stove. The joke was a stone thrown at her head. It hurt, but it did not break her. That night she went upstairs and lay on her mattress and listened to the roof creak and the wind running its small fingers through the eaves. She pressed her palm to the warped board and felt the pulse of the town under her. A small, steady hum. Eli watched the scene as if it were a small animal that had been cornered. He noticed the way Ruthie held on to herself as if to keep from spilling something private into a world that liked to take and keep. There was a shift in him then, a tightening behind the jaw, the sort of silence that meant a man was collecting his own courage. He didn't speak, not that evening. He came to the saloon the next morning and the next, and he did not laugh at Eliza's quips. He listened. He let his presence press on the town like the slow advance of a flood. The kindness that would split open the first quiet came when Ruthie saw a boy on the edge of town with his horse's bridle tangled in a barbed wire fence. The boy was Hartley Crane's nephew, an impossible name to say in the same breath as the woman's chilly passers-by, but that was the way of things. The boy had a cough in his chest that made him thin, and his hands trembled as if they were made of weather. Ruthie could have kept her head down and kept her hands to the pans. She had little business of her own to hold. But the boy's horse was whinnying and the wire had cut into the leather. Without thinking, she left the saloon and walked into the sun. Her apron brushed the grass. The world smelled of horse sweat and dust, and the light was a film of gold. She unhooked the wire with hands that knew how to pull things without tearing them further. She tied and braided and made the bridle hold. The boy watched her like someone who'd seen something miraculous and didn't have a name for it. He clutched the reins and then hugged the animal as if to assure it that good hands were upon it. Eliza's laugh came like an undercurrent when she and company rode by. "There she goes," Eliza called, loud enough to cause a ripple. "Still serving the town. What would we do without our own charity?" A few heads turned and smirked. Ruthie didn't answer. The boy's eyes were wet and luminous. Ruthie brushed his shoulder, and that was all. The moment was small and steady, like a pebble dropped into a bucket. It made a sound only a person with ears pressed close could hear. Eli watched from the saloon doorway. He'd been keeping a hand on the bar top like one keeps steady a ship's wheel in rough weather. What he saw stopped him in his steps. The way Ruthie moved had nothing theatrical. It had the weight of someone for whom small tasks were everything. His chest clenched, an iron knot that hurt as much as it warmed. He didn't speak. He did not need words. He put a coin on the bar and drew his hat low. The coin was heavy, but it bought him nothing and everything. After that day, he began to leave small things for her. Not gifts, he was not a man of extravagance, but small, right-sized mercies. A spool of thread left on the counter, a roll of fabric with a hint of blue, a jar of sweet syrup for the lemon cakes she made on the rare Sundays the saloon's crowd was low. He'd post them on the corner of the shelf as if they'd been misplaced. When Ruthie found the things, she'd glance up and see him at the door, and their eyes would meet like two trains passing on a single track. There was an unspoken agreement between them, a soft exchange that the town could not read because it was the sort of communication that happened in the cartilage of the heart. The kindness didn't make her free of the town's barbs. If anything, Eliza's quips sharpened as if acid had been added to her wine. She would say, "Careful now, someone might start thinking there are no distinctions left," and the others would snicker. There was a sense in the saloon as if the room had two halves, one that preferred silence and one that preferred the sting of a joke. Ruthie stood between them. She kept doing what she knew. Then came the day that shifted everything into a single sharp arc. Merrow's Bend had been on edge for weeks. A string of cattle had gone missing. An accusation lay across the town like a net. Men spoke quietly in corners and looked at each other like dogs treated as if they must defend their own. Rumors traveled faster than any horse. Sheriff Cole, who had the heavy duty of keeping the town in order, grew shorter with worry and longer with suspicion. He pinned watchmen at barns and locked doors that had never needed locks. The air tasted like iron. One night, in the middle of that heat, there was an argument at the saloon. Words were raised like pistols, and the room dimmed as if the lamps had blown out. Harsh voices threw accusations at a man with a thin mustache and strange clothes who had come in off the road. He'd been in town only a day, and the town's smallness moved toward him like a breath drawn in. The man, named Jardine, claimed innocence and said he was passing through, looking for odd work. Men didn't like the sight of him. He had no witness to vouch for him, and in a place where every face should have known a neighbor, he did not belong. Eliza's voice was sharpest of all. She said, "We'd best show him the way. If he stays, he should be made to pay his dues." The room erupted with a certain roar of approval. Words and fists were thrown like hay. Someone pushed Jardine out into the alley where a heap of broken crates lay in the moonlight. He was a man who smelled of garlic and foreign spices, and for that reason alone the town thought it safe to place blame at his feet. What happened then was small and quiet and a kind of theft. Ruthie stepped between a swaying lash and Jardine's back. It was as if time slowed, each person's breath made visible like smoke. The man with the thin mustache looked around, not sure why a woman accustomed to her daily chores had come between him and the crowd. She had her hand on the back of his coat, steady as a brace. She did not shout. She said simply, "He won't get by that way. Not here. We settle things where there's the law." Her words were a quiet blade. For the crowd it was an affront. For a moment the room paused as if listening for a missed reed in the town's orchestra. Then the snickering resumed. "The help thinks she's a sheriff," someone muttered. Laughter broke. Eliza clapped slowly, the sound a flourish of a sword. The sheriff touched Ruthie's elbow like one might touch a lantern to steady it, and then excused himself as if to fetch water. Jardine left that night, pushed by the wind or by men's hands. No one remembered which. He walked out under a sky that had the look of some god who'd fallen asleep mid-sentence. Ruthie went back to her pans. Later that night, after the lamps had been extinguished and the saloon's floor bore only the prints of boots now stilled, she sat on the back stoop and the wind pulled her braid loose. Eli came and did not announce himself. He sat a respectful distance away and lit a cigarette, the ember a small star. "You're steady," he said after a long silence. His voice was low and the cigarette's smell wrapped around it. The light made a crescent under his jawline and caught the shadow of a scar that ran from his temple to the edge of his mouth. A thin white seam like an apology. She did not look at him. "I've had to be," she said. Her voice was like a dry river rock, smooth and honest. He nodded. "Most folks see what they want," he said. "People don't often see what they ought to." There was a pause. A man sits on the porch of a home he doesn't own and waits. She let the silence give again. "You got a past that won't let you sleep, Mr. Hargrove?" she asked finally, and her mouth shaped the name as if testing it in her hands. He laughed softly, a sound that did not anger though it was salt-laced. "Something like that," he said. The smoke between them made a small cloud. "I've been running a long while. I know how that feels," she said. "Running inward." They sat and the town breathed behind the saloon's walls. The night was not kind. Could not be, not when men were quick to accuse and quicker to look away. They sat in the smallness of things, two people caught in a moment that was bigger than their own definitions. Ruthie returned to her work the next day with a thinness around her eyes that came from the sort of sleeplessness only bad dreams can offer. People noticed and said, "She looks tired." But they did not ask what had kept her awake. She couldn't say. What could she say? That in the alley the world had been loud and small, and the man had not been defended and she had chosen him over the chorus? That she had learned that kindness could be both a weapon and an exposed nerve. Eli began to call her by name with an ease that surprised the town. "Ruthie," he'd say and tilt his hat. The town's gossip mill churned. Men watched and tried to draw conclusions. It was easy to make work of anything. It was easier to gossip than to hold someone up. Then the town's cruelty coalesced into a sharper shape. A rumor spread, like fungus under a log, that there was something in Ruthie's past that disqualified her from any sort of respect. It was an old wound, and small towns are adept at making old wounds into new reasons for distance. They said her husband had flinched away from her ease with peasants. They said she had been in a place once where she had been forced to trade favors for shelter. The rumor needed no truth to be fertile. It grew in gullies. The claim was a thud meant to mark a place on the town's map. Don't go there. The rumor became the excuse for Eliza to begin her daily mid-afternoon sermon about modesty and the evils of public kindness. One afternoon, when the saloon was crowded with men who thought themselves bigger than their boots, Eliza called the room to attention. She stood with both hands on the bar like a castaway standing at the prow. "There's a line," she said, "between doing the work God gave you and putting yourself in a place of danger. We do not condone those who step over the line." The men cheered with that particular hostility that says, "We will be cruel together and then sleep." Eliza called Ruthie to the front with fingers that did not tremble. "You ought to know your place," she announced loud and sure. A woman like you should be careful with her charity. People will talk, and they'll say things that will hurt a decent reputation. The room filled with hoots. A coin clinked in a mug. It was, Ruthie knew, a hunt for spectacle. She had been the town's favorite object for small savaging. There was a secret. The louder the town was about chastising what it found improper, the less it needed to look at itself. Ruthie felt something in her chest break like a small twig. She said very little then. She turned and began to clean a glass, hands moving as if on their own. Her breaths made a small sound, the tight song of someone holding back a storm. Eli watched from the corner, and the hand at his jaw tightened as if he might bite down. He found his way to the bar, took his cup and set it down like an anchor. The room went on as if it had not noticed. Then, when Eliza's voice rose again and the men began their chorus of approval, Eli set his cup down with a sound that scraped like a knuckle on wood. He stood slowly as if preparing for a fight that would not light spurs. People noticed then how his chest had been a steady hill and how suddenly it had become a field of thunder. "That's enough," Eli said. He did not shout. He did not need to. The sort of quiet he used had a presence like a judge's gavel. The sound it made suggested consequence. He stepped forward and said her name as if it were a defense. "Ruthie doesn't need you to tell her where she belongs. She belongs where she chooses." Laughter broke and the room's electric coil tightened. A man from the back shouted something about outsiders, about meddling. Eli turned to him, and for once he spoke with an authority that did not come from a badge. His voice was low and measured, and it cut through the murmur. "You don't get to put your hand on a woman's name and call it sin on a whim," he said. "She feeds your bellies. She fixes your clothes. She keeps this place together with hands better than most men here. If you'd had to run far and still come back, maybe you'd respect folks who keep to themselves." The effect settled like dust. People shifted in their chairs, because when a man with an unlooked-for voice spoke, the room had to answer. Sheriff Cole cleared his throat and looked toward the door as if he might leave. Eliza's lips were thin and her eyes stung with fury. The room pressed in like a tide that didn't know where to break. "What makes you take up for her?" someone demanded. "You don't know her." Eli's face folded simply. "I know what I see," he said. "I know quiet strength when I see it. I know a person who gives of themselves without a show." It was not an eloquent defense. It was the kind of truth that pulled at a place in a man's chest and made him choose. For the town it was a new and awkward light. The men around the bar shifted uneasily. Some laughed as if to cover their sizing up, but it was not the same sound as before. The joke had lost its warmth. Ruthie did not smile. She did not look grateful because she did not need to be publicly saved. But her eyes, at the edges, held a small glimmer. Eli's voice had been a crack of justice in the room, one that didn't require her to say anything less than what she'd always been. No one in the saloon had expected a stranger to stand in her defense. And yet he had done so. The small flame of that defense changed things. Not immediately in the town's ledger or in the way people arranged their chairs, but in the way the air around Ruthie resumed a different sort of tension. She began to hold herself with a little less of the tightness that comes from being ready to take a strike. She walked through the saloon with her tasks done, and some of them left undone, because she had learned the strange weight of a kindness repaid. Eli did not remain only her defender. He became a presence that the town had to notice like clockwork. A man who would sit and sip his coffee and watch the way the light shifted on the bar. He became a friend by small increments. He knelt once to tie a shoelace on a child's boot he found undone, and for that smalling of a moment the saloon saw a man who was humane rather than heroic. The townspeople's gossip began to shift. They spoke of Eli Hargrove in furtive tones that smoothed the edges of their curiosity. He was dangerous if one measured danger by volume. He was not loud, but he was old in the ways that matter. The bond between him and Ruthie grew in the intervals between people, in the small gestures that have no witnesses. He left a coil of rope for her when he saw the old thing she used had frayed. She found a small whiskey jar of marbles for the boy Hartley. They traded favors like words they didn't say out loud. It was not romance exactly, It was a mutual tending, two lives offering one another a kind of small repair. There were moments when a look sat on the air between them and neither could catch it. Those were moments of hunger that they both pretended not to know. One evening, when the moon was little and the town's conversation had thinned, a bell rang on the edge of town. A rider came in with a face burned and the news that a man had been found on the road, a notch in his head and the blackening spiral of blood showing like a stain. The council of men and women in the town leaned forward, because violence thrummed like a current under the earth here. The rider's words were halting, as though he didn't cheer for the story he'd rehearsed. "Found him on the north stretch," he said. "Down by the arroyo. No shoes, no money. And blood." A collective breath hissed and a man from the back muttered, "Four in hand, maybe. It'll blow over." The sheriff went pale. He pushed his hat back on his head and left to inspect. The town watched him go like they watched a child walk to the creek alone. Eli watched him go as if he had a map memorized in his eyes. He did not move. That night at the saloon, the air was tight as a pulled wire. People dropped words carefully. Eliza's voice was a thread trying to bind a rent. She said, "We must be careful who we let through. We cannot pretend we are a haven for thieves." Ruthie bent over her mop and pushed the floorboards as if she were trying to get the rotten parts of the town out. The water in her pail was a color between sky and rust. She hummed, quietly, a song her mother had sung about steady work. Eli moved across the room and set his hand on the back of her chair. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. The touch was steady like the turning of a wheel. There are more kinds of hands than any town can measure. Hands that can make bread and hands that can hold someone in the minute that matter. He gave her that steadiness like an offered coat. Then the climactic violence happened in the center of things that no one could ignore. The man found on the road was not a man at all but a woman. Thin as a plank, hair a tangle of straw, eyes that had seen too much. She was a casualty of a highway where people traded in violence and neglect. She had been beaten and left like refuse. The sight of her staggered the town as if it had been hit with a cold wind in July. Men looked away. Women pressed their hands to their mouths. Ruthie knelt and laid hands on the woman's back as if on a newborn child. Her fingers found broken ribs and the white of a bruise. She moved like someone who had practiced care in the dark. The town watched the woman as if they were watching a scandal. Someone muttered that the woman had probably been drunk or a vagabond. Eliza's pious jaw worked. "Call a doctor," Ruthie said, and the words were a command. The town acted because someone had to. The sheriff sent a boy to fetch the doctor from Miramont, but Miramont was a long stretch and sirenless. For that hour the woman lay under the awning and Ruthie's fingers soothed the lumps of meat like a gardener would a plant. A procession gathered. There was the sound of boots clacking on the floor, of hush and of cough. People ranged from pity to accusation. They flung verdicts like pebbles. Ruthie worked in that raw spotlight without glamour. She wrapped cloths, poured water through a cup, and hummed. No one commented on how her hands shook while she stitched a torn sleeve back together. Only the work mattered. Her presence stopped the room's sharp edges. Eli did not step forward to bravely carry the woman. He simply sat nearby and watched as Ruthie laid out supplies. When the doctor finally arrived, hours later with breathless apologies, Ruthie helped him with the woman's leg. She whispered things low and quiet that soothed the woman's underbreath groans. There was no pause in her attentions. Her silence had become a place of refuge. Eliza watched the scene with a face that had started as lint. She glanced from the woman to Ruthie and found no leverage. Eliza's barbs deflated in a way that surprised no one more than herself. The less a town can use for its cruelty, the more it searches for new dirt to toss. What happened during that hour was a lesson in public humiliation and private salvation. Men who had offered jests the week prior found themselves asking how to do a bandage. They looked foolish. Eli's words in the days before rang like a bell that had been struck and would not stop ringing. The people of the town had to eat from that sound. From that day forward, the town changed in small increments. The kind of respect that one demands from a place is not a thing that shifts overnight. But something in Merrow's Ben's axis had been moved. Eliza continued her sermons. The sheriff did his rounds. People still wagged gossip like a faithful dog. But in the ways that matter, attitudes softened. Folks began to leave a coin for a loaf more willingly. Hartley's cough was tended with less suspicion. Men who'd once done nothing now learned to hand a coat. Eli continued to be a quiet presence, and slowly he became more than a friend. He would sit on Ruthie's sill sometimes late, and they would watch the stars lean down and press their stories into the rims of the night. One evening, in the low silvered light, he unbuttoned his sleeve and showed her the scar that had cut his arm years before. Ruthie ran her finger along it and didn't flinch. "I was picked off in a fight," he said. "Not the hand I'd care to talk about." She smiled a small, private smile. "None of us has clean hands," she said. "We just try to keep them from burning the ones we love." There was a newness in their silences. Ruthie began to tilt towards him in the manner of things that happen incrementally. She laughed with him once about a mess of spilled sugar, and the sound was a coin to be saved. They walked out sometimes into the night without much to say, and the air held their quiet together like two people sharing a blanket. The townspeople took to seeing them together and then to making peace with it. They were a pair that the town had not arranged. But old things die slow and new things are cautious. The rumor that had once clung like burrs to Ruthie was not completely expunged. People still held little grudges. There were those who considered Eli's attentions a weirdness, and some who resented the way he had stopped the town's jokes. A shopkeeper muttered that the town ought to be careful of who it let inside its warm hearth. The way the town hedged its bets was like a net thrown over a new lamb. In the meantime, Eli faced his own ghosts. He had a past that had roots like braces. He spent long nights sitting with his hands cupping a map of memory. Once he told Ruthie, in a voice so low she could barely hear, of a time when he'd been on the wrong side of a fight and a man had died under his hand. He told it as one might tell a list of errands. He did not seek absolution. He only sought to lay down the weight of it somewhere. Ruthie listened as if it were scripture, and then, in the hush that followed, she put her hand over his. "It has been known that truth can be the most intimate of loves." "I won't be your preacher," she said, and he smiled because she never had been a pious woman, and there was something holy in her lack of sanctimony. It was in this thinning of the world that he asked a question he had kept tucked in his chest. He did not come by it with fireworks. He came on a morning wash soft with a low cloud. He brought with him eggs in a tin pail and the silence of someone offering small things. They sat on the saloon's back stoop and ate cold eggs and bread. The world around them hummed quietly like some small animal sleeping. "Ruthie," he began, then paused, because words matter. He reached out and took her hand as if to test warmth and found it there. "Would you," he had to restart, "would you ever want to leave this place with me? Not to run, but to go somewhere quiet where people don't know every inch of you." She turned his fingers and let his hand be a map. Her eyes looked at the horizon and then sidelong at him. "I have a life here," she said. "Folks, rooms, work." Her voice was steady, and a little like a plow. "I know," he said. "I am not asking to take you from your life. Maybe it's I who would like to be part of it. But if you wanted, if you saw a different sky, it would be mine to give." Ruthie thought of the house she kept up there by the kitchen, the stove she scrubbed each month until it shone like a promise. She thought of the little widow who needed bread and the boy who in his cough had a face like a new moon. There was a tug to stay. But there was also an ache she had kept to herself, a longing for someone to be the cart when she needed help with heavy loads. Her life had been one of giving. She was tired. She had kept everything in tilted balance so long that the thought of leaning somewhere else felt like a dangerous math. She looked at Eli's face and saw not an offer but a patient asking. "I don't know what leaving looks like anymore," she said. "My roots are here in small stitches and old dust. But I like you, Eli. I like you enough that if there was somewhere else, I might go." He drew her close then with a care that did not seek to rush into anything. The world on the porch was brittle and kind at the same time. He pressed his forehead to hers and whispered, "The only fire I need burns right here in your touch." He smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. She closed her eyes and felt something give, like the hinge of a gate that had been stuck too long. From that contact forward, the town watched two lives slowly knit. They did not speak of marriage at first because both had a distrust of grand pronouncements. They did not need to stage a show. They shared a cloak and watered their small plants and came to know the cadence of the other like a favorite hymn. The town found it harder to gossip when the pair passed because gossip requires oxygen and goodwill in equal measure, and those had shrunk because the community had been asked, by the temerity of two people's decision to love quietly, to renew its standards. But happiness in a small town is freighted with its own challenges. Where the outside world solves a problem with travel or silence, a small town puts it up on a board and it becomes a lesson. Elijah's past, always present in the shape of an occasional man whose eyes traveled like a hawk and stopped on him, came back around in a way that made Ruthie stay awake at night. It was not enough that he came back into her life with a steady hand and gentle words. A man with a past like his would always be judged more harshly than others. There would be whispers below the bars. There would be a day when someone would throw a match and watch to see if the barn burned. It happened in winter, when the town's breath steamed and the world turned brittle. A letter came addressed to Eli in a handwriting that looked machine-tooled. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco. He opened it in the saloon like a man would unfasten an old wound. The letter bore a single line. "You cannot run forever," it was enough. It reawakened ghosts. It sent a chill through Eli that he could not shake. He stood on the porch that night, the letter in his pocket like an accusation. Ruthie found him there, leaning on the rail as if he had decided to become part of the fence. "What's in your pocket?" she asked. "Old things," he said. "A promise given and a debt unpaid." She came to him then, and it did not take words. She put her hand on his chest, felt the muscle work. "Then let me help you pay it," she said. Her voice had the weight of a person who'd been the ledger of the town and had learned that sometimes payment is a mutual thing. He thought of all the bad things he'd done and the long list of men he'd left in a line behind him like train tags. He thought of the shame that had taught him to walk alone. He thought of Ruthie's hands and what they had mended in secret. She held his face then, steady as if to say that the town would not be a tribunal if they did not let it. The danger did come, as if summoned by the letter. A man named Barnes, thin-eyed, with a look of a hyena and a temperament to match, arrived with a posse of men who had the town's smell about them. They were a group from the road, their boots fresh with brisk dirt, and they were the sort to look for trouble. They claimed a ledger of rightness and carried themselves with the certainty of an accusation. They looked at Eli with a face like an indictment. "You owe us," Barnes said. He had been a man associated with the darker trails of the past, the sort who collects favors and displays them like trophies. "You ran from what you owned. We have a debt to collect." Eli's mouth made a slow shape, like a coin falling and catching. He did not reach for his sidearm. He had outlived the need for that theater of power. He had been a man who knew how to fold danger into a morning and sleep beside it. He had also, in those days before Ruthie, committed things he would not confess aloud. The town's smallness watched it all with a heightened appetite for scandal. Barnes and his men came to the saloon and made their presence a spectacle. "Eli Hargrove," Barnes said, projecting his voice like a piped trumpet. "You have debts to pay, and we intend to collect." A hush fell like a veil. The saloon felt suddenly small, like a theater after the curtain rises and the actors stand uncertain. Ruthie moved until she was directly behind Eli. Her fingers closed on his sleeve like she was taking his anchor back. The town felt the moment like a rope taut across a canyon. For the first time since Barnes had arrived, someone else was in the face of danger. "You don't get to threaten my people," she said, and her voice made an odd sound. It was a soft weapon, a low cut. Her spine was as straight as a planted post. People looked at her as if they'd never noticed her before or had only just now. The strange thing about the town's cruelty was that it was rarely directed at the brave. It did not know how to hate courage that was just a calm breath. Barnes' eyes flicked over to Eliza as if to seek approval, and then chuckled. "She don't have much footing," he said. "A woman like her, a saloon girl, can't stop a man like me." Eli turned then. The look he gave Barnes was like a settled gun. "You leave," he said. "You take your threats and your debts away from here, or you'll answer for what you bring." There were punches that needed no throwing. Barnes laughed loud and hard. He spat on the floor. "We both know how this plays," he said. "Men like me don't leave without what's due." The moment prepared itself for violence. Chairs scraped and the room's composition shifted. The men who had laughed earlier suddenly found their own muscles tensing. Sheriff Cole, who'd started the day with the feeling of responsibility in his chest, came forward and said, "We settle things with words here, Barnes." Barnes' men moved forward with a crooked plan. They pushed toward Eli, toward Ruthie. Out in the street the wind came sharp. The town held its breath. It was then that Eli moved as if the whole of his life had been a rope he'd been ready to cut. He stepped forward and his hands were quiet. He reached for Barnes in a way that suggested he might wrestle the man down rather than kill him. Barnes laughed and swung. Eli ducked and caught a fist, and with the ease of someone who had wrestled in bad places, he sent Barnes into the bar. The crash like a warped him. The room held. Snow fell outside like white coins. The man hit the floor and the crowd erupted into warfare. Someone drew a knife. The saloon's lamplight winked and flared with each sudden movement. Ruthie did not stand idly. There comes a point where a person does not stand by because to stand by is to be complicit. She moved with farmer's grace, the sort of moves that come from caring for animals and children and the broken and the good. She separated men, pulled at sleeves, shouted people away. In the pack of men she found Barnes' elbow and twisted with a motion that was half trap and half prayer. Barnes wheeled, fury like sharpened glass. They took the fight out into the street like cowardly men who needed an audience. Eli followed. Men crowded windows, some to jeer and some to pray, and the town recruited silence as jury. The fight was in the square now, under the sign that said Marrow's Bend in faded paint. The winter ground crunched. The horses in the street stamped like the world was wrong. Eli's body moved like a man who had been trained by too many things that had required action. He didn't want to kill Barnes, he wanted to make it be done. Barnes, for his part, wanted his due and more. At some point in the fray, Eli found himself on his knees with a knife at his sternum. Barnes had him pinned down, a look of triumph on his face. The town's breath shivered. Eliza's mouth was framed with a beam of horror. Sheriff Cole hurried forward and a gun was pulled by someone else as if response must be immediate. Ruthie saw the glint of the blade and then saw her own hands move as if in a dream. She had no weapon. She had the only thing that could sometimes shame a man more than a bullet. She had mercy. Ruthie moved forward, pushed the knife aside with a sweep, and then wrapped herself around Eli and Barnes. She did not spare herself. She took Barnes' bladed arm and twisted until he shouted like a child. The movement was the kind that comes from someone who has practicality in their bones. In the tug, Barney's knife skittered and fell into the snow like a flat coin. Men scrambled. The sheriff moved in with clapping hands as if to arrest the imbalance of all of it. The town stood like parted curtains. Ruthie's face was turned away and she breathed hard. She had taken a knife meant for a man who had a history, and she had put her body between the world and him. She could have been praised. And for a moment the town stumbled in its none-too-easy morality. Instead of praise they gave a sound that looked like shame. Some muttered, "She shouldn't have done that." Others patted her arm as if relief required action. Eli sat in the snow with Ruthie leaning over him as if sheltering the one he'd been trying to keep alive. The sheriff took Barnes and his men away, his face drawn tight with the job of matching the town's anger with legal restraint. The crowd melted away, the kind that wanted drama now left to go to its hearths. It was then that the shock came for Ruthie, the shock of how small a body felt when so much was asked. Her hand on Eli's shoulder trembled. The world around her was an echo of the fight. Eli looked at her like a man who'd been redeemed in the center of a fight. He took her hand and pressed his lips to it as if to say pardon and gratitude in the same breath. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, and her voice was a soft thing like someone who had been given a gift. "You didn't have to." She looked at him, eyes shining with the sort of truth that only comes after one has walked through a fire. "I did," she said simply. "I couldn't watch you be taken and do nothing." He held her then with a gravity that spoke of more than desire. He drew her close and wrapped a coat around her shoulders. The cold air made their breath like steam. He cupped her face like someone who had been learning that faces could be maps and that he wanted to understand the whole of her. It was in that pressed moment that he said the line she'd heard earlier, though now it had a more deliberate cadence. "The only fire I need burns right here in your touch." She closed her eyes and let the world's sediment settle. They touched like two people trading maps. In that moment, the town's judgment had become irrelevant. What mattered was the two of them and the sense that something had been sealed between them that was bigger than the town's small cruelties. The months that followed the fight saw Eli and Ruthie pull closer in a way that made people speculate less and offer help more. The town was forced to recenter. Where they'd once whispered, they now spoke in tones of wonder. "Did you see how she moved?" He stood up to a pack like he's a man of honor. The barbs grew softer. Eliza held her sermons, and people listened with a different ear now. She had less room for cruelty. The sheriff learned the shape of fairness more than he had before. It was not that all sin had been bellied. It was just that the town's smallness had been re-educated a bit by a woman who chose to hold someone in the face of hatred. Eli's past, though, had a way of returning as if by tides, not storms. Barnes had not kept quiet in his arrest. He sought out men who owed him favors, and he walked the country like a dog on the hunt. There were nights Eli would toss in his sleep and Ruthie would hold him with the soft press of someone who had learned to tend another person's ghosts. He dreamed in small fragments, faces lit in wrong angles, the sound of boots on wet planks, the names of men who had been part of the ledger in his memory. "Tell me," Ruthie said once as they sat by the kitchen stove, the night pressing in through the window like a hush. She stirred cornmeal into the pot and the smell of cooking filled the room. The lamplight made the wood around them warm. "Tell me what it is that you fear. Tell me what's left to fight." He took in a breath. The kettle whistled like an old man. "I have caused hurt," he said. "I have stood on the wrong side of a thing and offered my hand in exchange. I have left men I should have faced. I thought to run from what I'd done. It wasn't enough. It's never enough to run." Her hands moved with domestic precision. She spread the bread for him and then set a plate beside him. "Then we stay," she said. "We don't run from what you did. We face it. You're not alone now." She said it with the conviction of someone who had mended a child's torn sleeve and did not flinch. This was not an easy thing in their world. It required courage to be honest, and it required what marriages sometimes require: the sharing of a burden. Eli stood in the town square one afternoon as men lined up to cast their own judgments, and he told them, in a voice that did not beg but that asked forgiveness, the contours of his life. He did not diminish his guilt. He didn't ask for immediate absolution. He didn't try to soften the truth. He laid his hands out like one would lay down tools and left them visible for all to see. There was an honesty in that. The town listened. Humiliation fell away like dead leaves and something like respect took root. Not all men accepted him. Not all hands were offered. But what had been a secret had been spoken aloud, and some of the weight of it had been enlarged by the speaking. Ruthie stood by him as he faced the town. Not as a token but as someone who had been through the motions of repair and came through. Their relationship matured like a barn roof that had been newly shingled over rotten timbers. Work and love together. They built a small back garden where they grew beets and potatoes and a stubborn tomato plant that seemed to want to live in spite of the climate. In the quiet of early mornings they would sip coffee and think of the things they'd saved from fire. A photo that had once been lost, a ring they'd found in the soil, the memory of the boy Hartley with his cough now stronger. As the years passed, there was a visible change in Marrow's Bend. It was not permanent, nor is any human change permanent, but it was the kind of small re-education that left a town less apt to throw barbs at a woman who had chosen to give her kindness without a collared demand. Ruthie had become someone people asked about for tasks that required care and accuracy. She had a name now that was said without the earlier shorthand of just the help. Some people still used the old phrase with the same rhythm as they might say an old prayer, but it had less bite. Eli and Ruthie remained steady. They did not have the kind of life that is pictured in postcards. They had hard work and tight budgets and nights when the weather threatened and the roof seemed too thin. They had days when they argued, not storms, but the small spats that come from two people who live close. They would then eat bread and laugh about the way the flour had found its way into their hair. In the mundanity of that shared life, they found something more holy than spectacle. What sealed them in the town's private memory was not an act of public heroism but a small, prosaic kindness. When Mrs. Pritchard's house caught on a small blaze one late summer, the two of them arrived with buckets and faces that had learned to be organized under stress. They carried out a trunk of old quilts, and Ruthie wept into the smoke because the quilts had been her mother's. People who had once stood at the bar now stood with hoses and a willingness to help. It was not a public exorcism. It was a slow reclaiming. The fire that threatened the old woman became a moment where the town recognized the kind of people who fought for one another. The couple aged like well-tended fences, with the paint chipped and the posts straight. They acquired a child in a way that felt like the slow nesting of birds, an orphan the town rescued from the road who had no name and who learned language like water. He grew under their hands and took to Eli with the ease of a cub to a bear. The town watched him bloom in the kind of middle ground that the adults had carved out for themselves. Ruthie, once the woman whose hands were calloused and hope-thin, leaned into the warmth of a life she'd never imagined. She held a child in her arms one night and hummed the song she'd hummed as a mop in the saloon, and the child slept. Eli sat before the stove with his hat folded in his lap and let his weathered face soften. In the small rounding of evening, they had made a life that resembled a quiet harbor more than an adventure novel, and they were both content in the way only those who have found a long-term harbor can be. The town kept its edges. There were still arguments, and Eliza still had sermons to deliver. Some of them softer now because the world had changed her margins too. Sheriff Cole retired and a younger man took up his hat. The saloon's floor continued to creak and to collect stories. And if one asked the town's older residents, they'd likely tell you that the place was not necessarily wiser, but that it had been made kinder by one small account of courage. They would tell you they had learned that a woman should not be spoken about in a room in the way one speaks about meat at the market. In a strange and small ritual, each year the town gathered on the anniversary of the saloon fight and told a cautious story. They did not do this as performances but as small recollections, like not tying lessons passed down. The story told, as it always did, how a woman named Ruthie had stepped forward and how a man named Eli had stood and said a truth, and how the town had responded. They told how a whisper could turn the tide. Ruthie and Eli grew used to the ways of it. They were not vain. They didn't think their story miraculous. They simply felt the slow arithmetic of life add up in a way that suggested a balance was possible. Sometimes they would sit on the porch and watch the road like two people used to waiting. A neighbor would pass and nod. The town's children would race by with their hats on crooked, and the old men would sit and make lists of the days. Once, sitting by the stove on a night when the rain had come and the roof sang its slow, soaked song, Ruthie looked at Eli and spoke the thing they'd both been trying to live out in its smallest grammar. "If this is all there is," she said, "it's more than I expected." He smiled and kissed her knuckles, his mouth promising more than his words would. "What we have is enough to set us from wanting too much," he said. He put his hand over hers like a seal. When she was old and the wrinkles around her eyes told of years of sun and laughter and grief, a neighbor asked Ruthie, in a quiet voice like a prayer, what she would tell a young woman in the town who worried about being stepped upon for her kindness. Ruthie thought a while and then said, "If you see a place to help, go. But remember this, kindness doesn't make you a victim. It is your armor. Learn to use it kindly, and also to use it for your own shelter." Eli added, with the weathered grin of a man who had been too many places. "And if someone stands by you for no other reason than to protect, take their hand. No one should have to stand alone." Their story wound down like a ribbon. They grew old and steady, and their small son took to the road in fits and starts, and the town watched him go with the same tenderness they'd once reserved for a man's folly. They died one autumn within weeks of each other. Ruthie passed first in the quiet of a room washed with lamplight and the smell of boiled coffee. Eli followed days later, his hand folded like a bird in his lap. The town mourned, and it kept on living like a thing that had been taught a lesson. Some people said it would have been better if one had gone in full peace and the other waited. But Marrow's Bend, which had always known the long calculus of life, thought otherwise. The truth is, people did not simply leave the world as they had found it. People left marks. They were buried side by side on a slope outside town under a small wooden marker. The marker had no embellishments, only the barest of words. Ruthie Hargrove, Eli Hargrove. Underneath, someone, maybe the town, maybe a grateful child, had carved a shorter phrase. The only fire I need burns right here. The town knew, without a preacher needing a sermon, that the phrase was not just a romantic turn. It was the careful truth. Some warmth is enough to keep you through long winters. If you saw yourself in Ruthie, if her story hit you hard, remember this: the truth of a life is held in small acts. Don't forget the ones who stay quiet. They are the roots that feed a town's shade. They buried them together, and the town attended with respect. The preacher gave a modest sermon on redemption and ordinary courage. Eliza, who had been one of the loudest in the beginning, stood with a face softened like old leather and shed a single tear. The sheriff spoke of law and the town its duty. People told stories of Ruthie's hands and Eli's quiet. The child they'd raised stood at the edge and watched with the sort of sorrow that matters more than an occasional grief. Children ran about and dropped wildflowers atop the graves with a bless of innocence. And so it went. For years after, when the wind ran through the eaves and the saloon's lamp shivered, people would look toward the small knoll and think of the couple who had done nothing spectacular and everything necessary. They had changed the town by first being mellow and then being firm. They had taught a lesson: to defend the defenseless, not to gloat over others, to love without the need to be applauded. A quiet moral settled like padded soil. If you saw yourself in Ruthie, if you recognize in her a woman who gives and is dismissed, remember the roots that grow in silence. They feed the things that rise. And that's how a whisper changed a town.